Good morning, everybody. Well, it's morning out here in British Columbia anyways. Thank you very much for joining this web presentation. My name is Dan Weary, and I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia in a group called the Animal Welfare Program, and I'm part of the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. As you'll see, I've got two very important co-authors here. These are students that have worked very closely with me in developing this presentation and also in the ideas that we'll talk about today. Joanna Mikowska and Joyce Sato-Ranhout, and I'll show you pictures of them in a minute and introduce them a little bit more fully. To begin, I just wanted again to thank you for taking part in this, and also to encourage you to use your the question feature. You can if there's anything I say as I go along, feel free to just sort of write out a question as it comes to mind. I'll deal with the questions at the end of the session, but yeah, please take advantage of the question feature. I'll look forward to hearing your comments as we go along. Okay. The title for today is this a little bit provocative, a good life for lab animals. And what I'm wanting to do is basically tell you a little bit of some of the experiences in our laboratory over the past year and a half in terms of different projects we've done with sort of radically enriched environments for lab rats, and what we've learned as a group, both about how to manage those environments, but also about how it's changed, about how we actually look at and understand the animals we work with. But before I get onto that, I wanted to just take a step back a little bit and tell you a little bit about the history of how I came to some of these ideas. As I was preparing for this talk, I spoke to some of my colleagues that were working in the lab animal welfare world, one of whom is my dear colleague and friend, Joe Gardner at Stanford University. And I asked Joe to describe what he thought as sort of this mouse utopia. And he said, well, utopia, I don't know, but I could tell you what mouse dystopia is. And he said, imagine if you were kept high up. Imagine if you were kept in light levels which are brighter than you like. Imagine if you were kept in an environment that was cooler than you like, but you didn't have access to materials to build a proper nest to really control your microenvironment. Perhaps also there was these looming predator stimuli from time to time. And as he went through this list, I began to realize that what he was actually describing was something that looked fairly much like our current rodent environments. And the other thing I did as I thought more about this topic was about, well, as we look at this kind of a structure, we see, of course, the cages, we see the wire racks, but we don't really see the animals unless we peer in awfully closely. And even when we do peer in and look at the animals, we got this impression of the animals as creatures that really don't do very much. Here's a couple of standard housed rats from one of our studies, and every once in a while they get some food. They may go to the drinker. They may or not go into the little PVC tubing that they've got there as their sort of enrichment. But overall, there's not a lot going. In fact, I've got a video of this that I'll play you a little bit later, and you can see that the video version isn't really very much more interesting than this still version that you're looking at now. So I think the housing, there's issues when we talk about the housing that we might understand in terms of not providing ideal environments, but also we are maybe creating a type of animal that maybe is less than what it would be if we provided a more complex environment for these creatures that we work with. So now I'd like to introduce you to the two stars of the show. On the left of your screen is Joanna Mikowska. She's doing her PhD on lab rats and trying to understand the emotional states of of laboratory rodents. And on the right is Joyce Sato-Reinhout. Joyce is particularly interested in the effects of socialization and human-animal contact on the behaviors of lab rats. Joyce and Joanna have also been using these very complex housing environments. So I'll walk you through a little bit about what that housing looks like and how we might be able to use it. Again, as I said, please feel free to write in your questions if you've got any as I go along. Okay, so here's one of the cages. This is actually Joanna's cage. And you can see there's a bunch of things going on. I'll just walk you through some of the different features she's got in the cage. She's got some lava rock. The animals can swing on it and play with it. A hammock the animals spend some time in. There's a climbing structure that I'll show you in a little while where that comes from. Ropes that the animals can use. A litter box. There's PVC tubes that the animals can use, and then actually probably the most interesting feature of Joanna's setup is the soil at the bottom of the cage. It actually is quite a big soil substrate that the animals can use to burrow in, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when we get onto some of the videos. So. Joanna in those cages is typically keeping 5 rats together. Sprague dollies, what she's used in this particular study, they're from Charles River, and they entered her environment after they were weaned at 21 days of age. In all our work, we're using this reverse light cycle, and that allows us to work in our active period, and the rats also work in their active period. As a way of making our work easy and fooling the rats on this, we use these low-pressure sodium lamps, which are emit this lovely sort of orange light, which we find quite bright, but the rats are basically blind to. So it seems dark to them, but it allows us to work and allows us to do the video recordings you're going to see. So a lot of the video recordings you're going to see, you'll notice this sort of orange glow, and that orange glow is because of those low-pressure sodium lamps. Okay, here's a picture of Jo's room. So she has a number of these different cages set up. She's actually interested in a number of the effects of different housing systems. So she's got a room like this where she's got a number of these enriched cages, and at the same room at the same time, there's animals in standard housing. And as we go along, we'll see some of the photos of what the animals in the 2 different housing systems are doing at the same time. Here is a picture of Joyce's setup, and as you can see, Joyce is actually using the exactly same cage, but she's just configured it a little bit differently. She actually wanted to create a structure that she felt was easier for day-to-day management, and for that reason, she didn't use the soil. Joanna was really interested in that burrowing behavior, so she wanted to have soil, but Joyce chose not to do it, and instead you'll see as a substrate, she actually provided layered blankets, and I'll show you in a minute as we look at some of those videos, the ways in which the rats actually are using that layered bedding as a way, or the layered blankets as a type of a burrowing structure itself. And you can see some of the other features that I showed you earlier, the lava ledge, climbing ropes, there's little tubes there, this time made out of fleece, hammocks, which we saw earlier. You can also see the vertical complexity. So the animals are able to actually use that up-down space quite a bit. They climb up and down between the different sections, as you can see in a minute. Okay, so Joyce used a little bit of a different setup. She wanted to use Long Evans rats. She was running experiments which really involved close human-animal contact. You can see her animals were very well socialized. And for that reason, she wanted to use the Long Evans. She kept a few more animals in the cage, but she was also using the reverse light-dark cycle with those low-pressure sodium lamps that I told you about earlier. Okay, I've now asked the people on the video side to play the first video, which is this intro to enriched cage. So Don, if you could play the first video. Beautiful. Okay. So we'll walk through in a minute what the different activities we're seeing there, the take-home message really from that slide is just the complexity of the things that are going on. Okay. Now I'd like to ask Don to play the second video, if you can, Don. Standard fast clip. And exactly the same time as that other recording. So you can see, gives you a sense of the contrast of what do these animals actually look like when they're in their more complex environment versus in a standard cage. Okay. Okay, so let's go back and sort of tease apart some of the complexity of the behaviors that we're seeing in these more complex environments. And obviously, one of the interesting things that these creatures can do when kept in this environment, which is all this vertical space, is they spend a lot of time climbing up and down. And they use different kinds of structures to climb upon. So on the left, you can see them just coming up and down on the wire, the front of the cage. The picture on the right has them climbing up and down in that plastic structure, and actually has a rat doing the sort of monkey bar move going along the top of the cage on some of the wiring. And these are the kinds of activities we see. Don, if you can please play the next video that sort of brings some of these climbing behaviors to life. Been reared in this type of environment from an early age. Give me a second. Okay, here's another behavior that we can see they can do in these environments where they have the opportunity to get up above the other animals. We call these perching, so it's just like a bird would perch. Typically, of course, in your standard cage, the animals don't really have that vertical space. They don't really have a shelf they can get up and look down on the rest of the world. I think of sort of the yertle, the turtle move, where they look to get up and see all that they rule below them. And you can see a number of different examples of the rats using different features in their cage. So on the left, just a bit of PVC tubing. The middle section is a rat perching on a section of hammock. And on the right is perching on that bag holder climbing structure, the pink structure. Here's another really interesting behavior that we see in these environments which provide more vertical space, and that's this full rearing movement. Rats actually do this quite a bit. They get up on their back feet and they stretch fully out. And I just want you to look at this comparison. So here on the left is one of Joanna's rats. You can see he's down in the soil in that substrate, and he's actually just sticking his nose over the top of the plexiglass barrier. You can see the sort of close-up of these burrows, and we use the plexiglass so we can see how the animals are burrowing. But you can see here in this case this rat sort of rearing up all the way, just so he can sort of stick his nose over the plexiglass and smell what's happening beyond the cage. Here you can see in a standard cage a rat trying the same kind of thing, and they can still get up on their back legs, but you can also see they're not able to fully stretch. Now, we of course don't know how important that is to the animals, but I can say that in other areas of animal welfare, this ability to complete body movements has been considered really important. So one of the issues that's come up in the discussion about the use of battery cages for laying hens is the inability for those animals to fully stretch their wings. And of course, one of the big issues in the gestation crates for commercial pig production has been that the sows are unable to properly turn around. So this lack of ability to complete the full normal body movements has been considered to be an important part of what it means to provide a good life for other animals anyways. Another really interesting thing that these animals do, of course, in this bigger, more complex environment is all this running, bounding type movements. And so I've got this picture here in the bottom. You can see the rat in the bottom left-hand corner of the cage. And when the video starts, that Don's going to show on the next slide, that's where I want you to focus your eye, is this animal showing its... so Don, if you can play the next video, please, that bounding clip. The kinds of movements these animals are able to do in this environment. Okay, I'll switch you back again, and we'll go on to the next clip. Okay, this is basically just an opportunity to show you gratuitously cute rat picture slides. These are Joanna's rats in one of her hammock structures, and they're just sort of hanging out in the hammock. They use these structures quite a bit, sometimes by themselves, but sometimes in groups. And sometimes you can see quite a few animals in the same structure. This is to show them interacting with the various kinds of furnishings we put in the cage. I'm showing you this one on the left because some of you, we've seen it already in a couple different pictures, but this is more of a close-up. A cute picture with a bunch of rats using it. But also maybe some of you will recognize the structure now from your own kitchen cupboard. This is sold in IKEA as a cheap little plastic bag holder, but it seems to work pretty well for these rats as well. They enjoy using it, both as a place to hang out in and, of course, to climb in that we saw earlier. Okay, now this burrowing behavior, very interesting, and of course, Joanna was really interested in the burrowing behavior, and that's why she provided this soil substrate at the bottom of her cage. The animals use it a great deal. Right from day one, they're digging in there and they're moving it around. There's quite a bit of change in the burrow structure from day to day. The animals bring different material down there. I'll show you in a minute where they're working with the treat ball down in the burrows. Sometimes they'll bury the PVC tubing. They use the soil structure quite a bit, and they do a fair amount of burrowing when you give them the opportunity. And of course, I've got some video to show you them doing this behavior. So, Don, if you could please play the next clip, the burrowing clip, that would be great. To call that equivalent to burrowing or not, but it's interesting that they're making use of the various kinds of enrichments we provide them to do something that, at least to me, looks sort of like it has it's related to that burrowing behavior. Gives them the opportunity to hide underneath the structure, and again, as I say, they certainly take advantage of it and spend quite a bit of time doing that. Okay, here's getting closer to maybe something that you see more routinely in our rodent facilities, and that's providing the animal some kind of interactive treat that they can work with. I've given you two different examples. One's a homemade one, one's a commercially available one. On the left is one that Joyce was using that she found really worked well for her her rats just a toilet paper roll, and it's sort of folded up, and she stuffed various goodies in there. These ones have hay and sunflower seeds. And what's nice about this is it gives the animal something to work at, and it's something that's destructible. So it makes it very interactive. It's not static. It changes over time, and it also is inherently reinforcing, because not only is there the fun of tearing it apart, opening the Christmas present, if you will, but there's also the fun of discovering what's inside it. The one on the left is giving out, as I said, this hay and sunflower seeds. The one on the right, some of you might recognize as a cat ball. I mean, these you can buy at your standard pet store. And you can change the aperture. There's two interlocking plastic sleeves there. And you can change the orientation of those plastic sleeves to give out different amounts of treats as that ball rolls. So that ball you can put different treats in there. As the ball rolls, the treats will fall out, and depending on how big the hole you provide, more or less treats can fall out, right? Okay, to give you a sense of what that looks like, if you can play the next video, John, this is rats interacting with one of those treat balls. That ball's all recently been put in, so a lot of action on the ball right now. Okay, so just by way of summary then, let's go back. I want you to turn your mind back to those two videos I showed right at the beginning. The diversity of behaviors and the kind of things that rats do when kept in more this naturalistic environment, and then the rats in the standard housing. And obviously one of the things that we're providing the opportunity to do is dig and burrow in the one environment. Obviously there's this opportunity for climbing, making use of the vertical space within the cage. This perching behavior, so you give the animals a chance to get up on a ledge and look down. They seem to use that and enjoy it. The ability to rear fully, to fully stretch. Interesting that the animals just aren't really able to do that in our standard cages. This bounding, running movements are, of course, they're able to do when they've got more room to move around. Object interaction, well, that's up to us, of course. We could be providing more opportunities for interaction in standard housing. Often that's not the case, at least not this kind of really interactive object like the ones I was showing you earlier. These are things that both Joyce and Joanna did routinely for their animals, and they felt that it was an important part of providing this more complex environment for the rats they're working with. Okay, so we've walked through these sort of very complex, I think really interesting situations that Joyce and Joanna were using, but some of you are probably thinking, well, okay, what does this have to do with reality? How can I possibly try to harness some of the elements that we've talked about so far in terms of the day-to-day work that I do? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of examples of housing systems which I think are imaginative but maybe more practical for some of you to consider. In this first example is some housing that was shown to me by Becca Franks. Becca is a new postdoctoral researcher in our group, and this is work that she did with colleagues at Columbia University, taking advantage of existing mouse facilities and just making them more interesting. So this is a photo from the top. You can see a series of larger cages, but standard rodent cages. And what she's done is she's just put PVC tubing connecting various cages, sometimes short pieces connecting 2 cages, sometimes longer pieces that connect over to 3 cages. And what this does is it creates this series of interconnected cages the animals can go between and can provide different types of facilities. So you can see there's different types of environmental features in this cage. Over to the far right, like you saw in the earlier schematic diagram, there was also some darkened cages, and that gives the animals the ability to hide in a darkened area when they want to avoid the bright light. So you can imagine using this type of facility, again, very standard in the sense of our typical rodent houses, but just a few manipulations have the opportunity to make allow the animals to show a much wider range of behavior and environmental preferences. Here's just a close-up showing some of the things that these mice are doing, so crawling from cage to cage and interacting with various objects within the cage. Also allows, of course, in this case, for a much larger total group size, right? Here's another interesting commercially available caging system. It's called the Marlowe cage. It can actually be used for both rats and mice. It's a very cool structure. You can see that it has two different levels. So basically, there is a bottom level which has most of the day-to-day things the animal wants to do. A drinker, there's actually a running wheel there. There's a food hopper, very importantly. But in order to access the food hopper, the animal needs to go across the top of the cage. And the top of the cage has a maze, and it's a maze where the configurations can be changed. So basically, you can add a bit of cognitive complexity. It's already a much more complex environment than your standard cage, and it can be made intentionally more complex by changing around the maze structure. So very, very cool structure indeed. Here's a sort of schematic and a top-down picture of it. So you can see some of the different maze configurations. Cool feature of this cage is you can change the mazing without actually disturbing the animals at all, because the animals spend most of their time down at the bottom. So you can vary the maze structure while leaving the animals sort of quietly in their home environment. Interestingly, there's been some studies done looking at some of the effects of these kinds of more sort of cognitive complexity, and it looks like there's quite a bit going on. I won't show you too many of the scientific results, but here's just one neat little graph showing how the animals housed in conventional cages differ from animals that were kept in this Marlowe cage in terms of their performance in a water exploration task. So the animals come into this swimming task, and you can see the conventional animals on the left-hand side of the slide are basically following the edges of the walls. That's why all the red lines, these are just tracings, and you can see the animals are spending almost all their time just swimming around the edge. Now look at the animals on the right, the animals that are coming from the enriched environment, and you see this much more complex environment. The animals are actually swimming around and using that space much more completely and actually more effectively as well. Okay, here's something that's even easier perhaps to imagine in a very standard rat facility. This is like our standard rat cages, but it's got a higher roof to it, and that's, I think, really important for two reasons. It allows for that full rearing movement that I talked about earlier. They're able to stand up completely. You can see the one rat at the bottom actually doing that. It also allows the opportunity to give a little bit of interesting vertical space. So you can see there is actually a shelf there at the back. It's just a very simple shelf, but you can also see one of the rats using that shelf. It also, because we do have more space inside the cage, it allows the opportunity to provide different types of shelters which might be useful for the animals. And so a few different things to think about there. What I like about this structure, just especially as a way of getting people to think about moving their animals to more complex environments, is it's really a practical option. It could be integrated into the majority of existing rat houses, I think. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the facilities we provided, and that's really important. But I think it's also equally important to think about the effects that we are having on the animals. So the the environment for the mice and the rats that we keep isn't just the result of the sort of the cages we put around them, but it's also the result of the social environment we provide them. And that social environment, of course, will include other animals in the cage, but it also includes us. And that us component might be a negative thing if the animals find us very fearful to interact with, if we are doing things to the animals which increase that level of fearfulness. But I would also argue that it can be a really positive thing. I think it can be a positive thing for the animal, and I'll show you some examples in a minute why I think that is. But maybe equally importantly is I think it can be a positive thing for us, for those of us who spend our time working with these animals. Having a positive social interaction with the animals we work with, I think, can make that experience much more enriching and pleasant for us. So let's walk through some of the different ways that we interact with the animals in ways which we might be able to improve that. And I'm going to, in this case, start with some sort of simple examples that might be easy to imagine. And my favorite example of this is one of just the handling of lab mice. And this is a beautiful study done by Hurst and West. This is published in Nature Methods a couple years back. And it just has to do with this simple differences in the way we pick mice up. And here you can see a mouse being picked up in the very standard way of being picked up by its tail. What Hurst and West did is they wanted to compare different types of mouse handling and what the mice might think about that. So I'm going to show you a sequence of 4 videos, and I want you to watch these carefully. So in the first video I'll ask Don to play is a picture of a mouse being picked up by its tail for the very first time. So if you can play that video, please, Don. In fact, you can just play them in sequence if you'd like. Strain for a minute on the researcher's hand, and that happens day after day after day. Same thing happens for the next video, Don, if we can go to it. If you can play the next video, please, first time. So you can see it's just a glass metal tube. The animal can go back and forth in it, and the animal just is encouraged to enter the tube, and it's just held in the tube. Okay, now you can imagine the animal, this happening day after day. And now if you can just play the next video, please, Don. These are the animal's cage. You can see one mouse trying to bury the hand. Certainly doesn't seem like the mice are very interested in approaching that individual. Okay, Don, if you can play that last video now, the 5-tube video, please. Animals are showing sort of typical exploratory behavior, just entering that tube and going back and forth. So really a dramatic difference there after a number of sessions where the animals have been picked up in one method or another. These are some slides of data that Hurst and West collected. There's 3 different strains they were using. They're also looking at sex differences. But really the most important thing that I want you to concentrate is the different types of handling method. And you can see on the left hand of each of those panels are the animals being picked up by the tail. And the very first thing I want you to see is this voluntary time interacting with the experimenter's hand. And you can see those animals that are picked up by the tail show very little interest in coming and approaching the experimenter's hand. And that's regardless of strain. If you compare it then with animals that are picked up in the tunnel that I showed you, they're much more willing to come and approach the handler and spend time interacting with the handler. So very interesting results. Again, very simple kind of aspect, of management aspect, but it can have important effects on the mice, I think. Okay. So we've talked about one example, which is probably something which would, at least when it's picked up by the tail, the results from Hurst and West would suggest is maybe a bit of a scary thing to happen. Now let's go to a different type of example and think about, well, what might be some of the things that we could do with the animals that we keep that are actually positive for the animals? What type of positive human interactions might we provide? And this might sound sort of like a bit of a foreign concept when we're talking about lab rodents, but it's actually standard practice when we talk about other animals. This is actually a quote from the Guide to Care and Use of Lab Animals when talking about dogs and cats. So they say dogs and cats especially when housed individually or in smaller enclosures, should be allowed to exercise and provided with positive human interactions. And I think we should take that kind of quote to heart and wonder how we might actually be applying that to other kind of creatures as well. So I'm going to walk through some examples about how we might be able to apply this to our lab rats. And I'm going to start off with one of my favorite examples from the lab animal research world, and that's the work of Jaak Panksepp's on tickling of rats. And if you guys have never seen this before, I really encourage you to look at some of the videos and see some of the research on this. But I've got one video set up here. Don, if you can please play the tickling clip. And actually, I'll ask you to replay it a number of times. If you can play it with sound, that would be super, because if you listen carefully, you can hear these 50 kilohertz calls that the rats are making while Jaak is doing this rough and tumble play with them, these tickling movements.
We realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained...
Just if you can play that a couple times, please, Don.
We realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained... It's
quite rough. Rat seems to be approaching Jaak's hand. If you play it one more time, too.
We realized that we had to look at the sounds at a very different register than we can hear. So we obtained...
Yeah, so I really encourage you to look at some of that yourself. It's a very interesting type of research. I've only got time to show you one of the sort of scientific results slides from that work of Panksepp's lab. This is a study published by Sylvie Cloutier and colleagues in the Panksepp lab in 2012. And she's looking, in this case, at those 50 kilohertz calls, which are these calls that seem to be associated with play and positive affect in rats. And what she's doing is she's got a number of different comparisons there in terms of how the animals are housed, individually, in pairs and triplets. And she's looking at how much of those calls she gets from the animals during the task when they're exposed to the experimenter, either when they haven't had minimal exposure or when they've been tickled by the handler. And you can see many more of these 50 kilohertz calls are happening in all of the housing groups. You get more of these 50 kilohertz calls associated with positive affect for rats that have been tickled. Here's a different measure on the right. It's a response in an open field test. One of the typical kinds of response measures we see in an open field test is just the number of quadrants the animal crosses, how much it uses the cage. You can see that typically more fearful animals do less of these movements. They stay more still. And what you can see in this case is that the animals that are tickled are showing more of this square crossing. In other words, they're showing lower level of anxiety. In this case, that effect seems to be particularly strong for the individually housed animals. And likely what's going on is those individually housed animals are particularly sensitive to this effect of human tickling, because the human, their human companion becomes really important as a social companion because they don't have any other social companion. Anyways, very interesting results from that Panksepp work, looking at just this one form of social interaction, but it's a form of social interaction that might be especially important to the rats. Okay, so I've given you a couple sort of more sciencey examples of how we can begin to understand what might be appropriate social enrichment for these animals in terms of our own interactions with them. But if you think about it, where could we go to for a better understanding of how to properly socialize and interact with rats? And one of the things that I learned from Joyce is that there's this entire subculture out there of people that are rat fanciers, people that keep rats as pets. And they actually, because they're spending a lot of time with these animals, they know an awful lot about rat husbandry and about how to properly socialize the animals they work with. And in fact, Joyce herself came from a history of keeping rats as pets, and this is one of Joyce's pet rats here you can see on the side. I think there's a lot that we can learn from these rat fanciers and people who keep rats as pets. What Joyce was doing in the experimental setup I showed you is she actually was doing a study on inequity aversion, and it required actually rats which were extremely comfortable around her. And she also wanted to have rats which would freely enter and leave the experimental setup at their own when they wanted. She felt this was important in terms of getting robust results from her experiment. And so Joyce put a lot of effort into socializing her rats. And it's important to distinguish here between simply habituating the animals so they're less fearful of us when we approach, and really socializing the animals so that animals that actually enjoy and seek out contact with their human handlers. This is a slide just outlining some of the things that Joyce did. Joyce would go in and visit with her rats. She would do some gentle and playful handling. She would provide treats. She would sometimes carry them. She'd allow them to explore the broader environment, not just within the cage, but actually within the rat room that she had. So these animals became very used to being around Joyce. And I'll just show you a slide. These are rats now after they've had some experience doing this. And this is Joyce about to start one of her experiments. Just to set up the video, you'll see Joyce takes the rat out of the cage and puts it on top of the cage. And then she calls the rat for it to come and start the experiment. So Don, if you can just start that first video, please, that would be great. The behavioral training video.
Good girl. Good girl. Come on. Good girl. Oh, come. Good girl. Good girl. Good girl. Good girl. Good girl.
Enter the apparatus, and it enters the apparatus. So it gives you a feel for these socialized animals now, and gives you a feel for the kinds of things you can do with these rats once they're trained and freely entering the experiments. Okay, let's just proceed to the next video. This just shows Joyce interacting with some of her rats, give you a feel for what that day-to-day interaction looked like. So if you could play the next video, please, Don. Oh, sorry, that got cut a little bit quickly on mine. But you can see basically Joyce just sitting there, rats approaching, and her doing some of that rough and tumble play behavior that you saw in the Pankset video. We actually have a bath detector in the room at the same time, so we can hear when the rats are producing their 50 kilohertz calls, and that turns out to be really helpful when you want to know what kinds of play behavior is really working for the rat's perspective. So you got a situation here that Joyce has obviously worked closely with her rats and has developed this relationship where the rats are freely approaching her, spending time with her, entering her experiment. One of the things that's really interesting in Joyce's experiment is you find that the rats are also seem to generalize this willingness to approach and interact with people to other handlers. So in the next video I'm about to show you, if you can play the next one, Don, this is Joanna actually interacting for the very first time with Joyce's rats. You can just see what happens here.
I can't see what's happening. Thank you, girls. Hang on. Deep breaths.
To approach and hang out with her. So yeah, that's what a well-socialized rat looks like in terms of it interacting with even actually a completely novel handler in that case. Here's another video. We can just ignore that one. That's not going to go. So we'll just go to the next one. Here's another. Just some still pictures. This is another one of our students, Darren, and Darren here is interacting with Joyce's rats for the first time. You can see they're doing the same thing, sort of not very fearful behavior, quite happy to crawl out of the cage, check out Darren, crawl around him, crawl back in the cage, etc. Actually, it comes back to that point I was talking earlier. You can see just from the looks on the faces of these handlers that it's obviously become a very interesting and pleasurable activity interacting with rats for these lab animal techs. Okay, so what do we have then as some of our take-home messages from that social environment? One is that in almost everything we do, we have to work with our lab animals, and often we will have some kind of habituation procedures that make the animal less fearful of us, but that habituation is not the same as the socialization. If we properly socialize animals, like I've shown you with Joyce's rats, it looks like those animals begin to really enjoy the interaction. They actually seek it out. They do these 50 kilohertz calls, etc. And I think we also benefit from working with these socialized animals because they're way more interesting and fun to interact with. I'd also point out that we talked in the housing side of things that we have these very complex environments. In some facilities, this might be either too expensive or too impractical to provide for the animals, but socialization is actually really easy to implement. It doesn't require any special equipment. It takes some time, but what we found is it's something that actually people really enjoy doing, and at least in a university like ours, there's no shortage of undergraduate assistants and volunteers that actually seem to really seek out actually opportunities to do pleasant activities with animals like socialization can be. It's also really important to do the socialization early in life. We've got another video here. If Don can play it, please, Don. These are Joyce's long-Evan rats the first time she met them, and you just see how fearful those animals are on the very first encounter. Next video, please, Don.
Are you guys terrified? Are you totally terrified?
Clumping up on the other side of the cage, avoiding the hand. Okay, now compare this. Go to the next video, please, Don. These are some home-reared pet rats, and then these have received interaction from a young age while they're still with the mom, and they're also weaned a little bit later. But anyways, just have a look at see how these behaviors are responding to the human handler. Next slide. Next video, please, Don.
Babies, hello.
We've already been doing quite a bit of exploring, as you can see, crawling out on the experimenter's hand, etc. So, very interesting contrast there, I think. Okay. So some of the things that these people who keep pet rats say is that it's really important to handle early in life, handle the animals while they're still with the mother. They actually also, as I said, wean a little bit later, and I think that's important. And I think another thing that's really important is because the people who keep the animals actually value the interaction they have with the animals, they are breeding for temperament. So the temperament of these animals is not surprisingly more amenable to this type of close human-animal interaction that I've shown you. I think we in the lab animal world could learn from all 3 points actually. Okay. One of the other cool things about having these animals which are highly socialized is it actually means that it's much easier to imagine a life after the experiment for these animals. So in the case of Joanna's work, I should say Joyce's work, all of her rats were easily adopted out. And here's one of the adoptees of one of Joyce's rats. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Typically, we think of the responsible thing to do with our lab animals after the end of the experiment is to euthanize them. But interestingly, when you talk to people who keep dogs in research facilities, at least in some facilities, there's increasingly the move to think of the research bit as just one bit of the animal's career, essentially. And that changes a bunch of things. And one of the things I think that's really powerful about it is that changes the way people think about what their responsibilities are to those animals. And so if you think of yourself as a steward of the animal for while you're using it in research, but that eventually the animal will go on to be somebody else's pet, I think that changes the way we think about the animals and what we think about as our responsibilities to those animals. Okay, so we've gone through a number of points, both from the housing and the socialization. And I wanted to, right at the very end, bring this back to what I think things that, for those of you that are maybe working now in a lab animal facility, what are some of the things you might be able to do now, and maybe what are some things which we can think about as where we want to be in 3 years' time, and where do we want to be in 10 or 20 years' time? So level one, things that I think that we could increasingly be doing today is this idea of providing interactive treats. These things which are manipulable by the animal, things like the toilet paper roll or with treats stuffed in it, or maybe a treat ball. And also the idea of integrating these gentle handling protocols, things like tickling or tubes. In a little bit longer terms, I want you really thinking about how we can go into a facility and change in a way that still works for the facility manager, but makes for a better life for the animal. And I think these idea of using these slightly more complex cages, these interconnected cages or cages with higher lids, commercially available caging like the Marlowe one, can really provide important advantages. Also, the advantage of doing that socialization protocol can be extremely important, and at least beginning to think about how that might form a part of creating an adoption policy for some of the animals in your lab. And finally, I guess what I really hope most of all is that I've inspired you a little bit to think about these rats in a different way, rats and mice in a different way, and the complexity of the behaviors that they can show when we've provided them a more naturalistic environment. And I think there's a lot we can be doing to provide these animals with a much more natural environment that allows for a much fuller repertoire of their behaviors. And that as part of that, to be including a socialization routine, which really means that the animals are enjoying their interaction, not with just the caging, but also with the people that work with them. And finally, I'd like to just end by encouraging you to think about ways in which you might be able to incorporate some of your own research in ways that incorporate socialization in these more naturalistic environments. And on that note, I just want to thank the funders of our research, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada and Charles River Laboratories for support for our work as well. So thank you very much. And I'll now turn to the Q&A. Please let me know. Please feel free to write in if you have any other questions as I go along, but I'll try to answer some of these questions that are up here now while I can. So, okay, first question is about the Marlowe cage and whether it requires a special cleaning system. I can't answer that, I'm sorry, but I encourage you to if you just Google that Marlowe cage, you'll come to the manufacturer's website, and you'll be able to find more information about how that can be managed within a laboratory animal facility. I've got another question here. Just give me a second so I can see it fully. It's a question from Terry. Terry's a consultant. Thanks for your question, Terry. Her question is, the 2011 guide has increased emphasis on occupational health and safety, including reducing exposure to allergens compared to previous editions. How are you reducing exposure of personnel to animal allergens during socialization procedures? So, quick answer there, Terry, is we're not. And, I guess more generally, I see these things, of course, I totally understand where they're coming at with those requirements, and of course for some workers that have issues, that's really important. But I also think we need to be changing the way we imagine what is the facilities, the ideal facilities we provide. And the more we put barriers between us and the animals we work with, the more we treat them as disease vectors as opposed to individuals that we can benefit by interaction with, I think there's a loss there too. And so I understand the pushback in terms of that. I think that needs to be respected, but I think there's a legitimate call, and we need to also be pushing for opportunities to provide real, meaningful interaction with the animals. And there's different ways of doing that. So, good question though, Terry. Another question here. This is from Brenda, and Brenda asks, rats are highly intelligent animals. Often they have latrine areas within the cage. Do either researchers observe that there are rats kept in enrichment, sort of reusing their latrines or keeping their area clean? Quick answer is yes, absolutely. We did provide opportunities for the animals to have a latrine in those complex environments, and they use them. They don't use them perfectly, but they use them. The practical aspects of getting that housing to work in a way where we're taking advantage of natural behavior, like that use of latrine, while at the same time sort of using materials which we can keep clean if we need to, I think is really important. And I think that really, to be honest, Brenda, I think there needs to be more work done in that area in terms of getting the right mix. As I said, our research is about really proof of principle, showing what the animals can do in these environments, but we all need to be doing more work to try to make those practical. And part of that practicality is taking advantage of the natural behaviors that the animals do, like searching out latrine areas. We're running out of time, but let's take one last question here, and I'll just take them in the order that I got them. So this is a question from Deidre, and Deidre's here in British Columbia. Thanks for the message, Deidre. Her question is, did you put the rats in larger cages only after socialization, or were they willing to come out before they were socialized? So the answer is, Deidre, we were using those larger cages right from day one. And Joyce was able to socialize those animals even in that environment. It just takes time. I think if Joyce was here, what she would say, it would be way easier if she was starting earlier. She had wished that she'd had those animals from birth, and I think probably if she was to create the perfect environment for those low cages, it would involve some sort of small group, smaller environment interactions, maybe when they're still with the mom, or maybe in the first couple weeks, and that would have made the later interactions much easier. Since we're out of time, I guess I'll just thank everybody very much for your questions and for your interests. Also say that please feel free to write if you have to email me. I'm easily Googleable. If you don't have my email address just right up there on the presentation, please just look me up and send me a note. I'll probably send that on to either Joanna or Joyce, who are the real experts. And I guess I really want to end by thanking my colleagues and students that have inspired me so much in this work, and that's Joanna Mikowska and Joyce Sato-Reinhold. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.